The stadium held its breath. 50,000 voices that had been roaring just seconds before fell into a silence so profound you could hear a child's heartbeat from the bleachers. There, on the emerald field where heroes are usually measured in yards and touchdowns, stood a different kind of hero. The desert camouflage uniform seemed almost out of place against the pristine white lines of the football field, but the man wearing it belonged exactly where he was, walking slowly, deliberately, toward the sideline where a small figure in a team jersey had frozen mid. The camera caught it first. The moment recognition flickered across a 7-year-old's face. The foam fingers slipped from tiny hands and fell forgotten to the concrete. Those bright eyes, the same shade of brown as the soldiers, widened in disbelief, then began to glisten with tears that would soon mirror those of everyone watching. "Daddy." The word was barely a whisper, carried by the stadium's perfect acoustics to every corner, every heart. The soldier's composure, trained through months of discipline and distance, cracked like glass. His own eyes flooded as he opened his arms, and in that gesture told a story that had been 8 months in the making. But how did this moment come to be? How does a father's heart survive the weight of missing his child's biggest moments? And why, on this particular Friday night, did destiny choose a high school football game to write one of its most beautiful chapters? Staff Sergeant Michael Chen had been deployed to Afghanistan for 8 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. His daughter Emma knew the exact count because she marked each day on the calendar hanging above her desk, a ritual that had become as sacred as her bedtime prayers. The deployment was supposed to last 6 months. Then it stretched to 7. When the 8th month arrived, Emma stopped asking her mother when Daddy was coming home. She'd learned that hope could be a fragile thing, easily broken by phrases like mission extension and operational requirements. But what Emma didn't know, what nobody in that stadium knew except for her mother Sarah, who sat 3 rows up clutching her phone with trembling hands, was that Michael had landed at Fort Campbell just 18 hours earlier. His flight from Kuwait had been delayed twice, his connecting flight from Atlanta canceled, and for a moment it seemed like he might miss this night entirely. This wasn't just any Friday night football game. This was homecoming at Jefferson High, where Emma served as the youngest member of the cheerleading squad. She'd earned her spot not through family connections or politics, but through sheer determination and a backflip that left the coach speechless during tryouts. Michael had promised he'd be there. That promise was made on a crackling video call 6 months ago, when Emma's face had filled his laptop screen in a cramped tent thousands of miles away. "Promise me you'll see me cheer at homecoming, Daddy," she'd said, her gap-toothed smile breaking his heart into manageable pieces. "I promise, baby girl," he'd whispered back, not knowing if it was a promise he could keep. The uniform he wore tonight still carried traces of desert sand in its seams. His duffel bag sat in his truck in the parking lot, next to a teddy bear he'd bought at the airport, a replacement for the one Emma had given him, now worn soft from 8 months of being carried in his chest pocket during patrols through. Sarah had orchestrated this surprise with military precision. She'd contacted his commanding officer, coordinated with the school administration, and somehow managed to keep the secret from Emma despite their daughter's uncanny ability to sense when adults were hiding something important. The game program in Sarah's lap was folded to page 7, where Emma's picture appeared with the other cheerleaders. Underneath her photo, in small print that most people would overlook, was a line that had made Sarah cry when she first read it. "Emma Chen, grade 7. My hero is my daddy, who keeps us safe while he's far away." Now, as Michael walked across that field, every step bringing him closer to the promise he'd kept, the weight of those 8 months seemed to lift from his shoulders. The desert, the danger, the nights he'd lain awake, staring at pictures on his phone, all of it had led to this moment. But Emma still didn't know he was there. She stood with her squad, her back to the field, leading the crowd in a cheer her father had never heard, moving to rhythms that had developed in his absence. The space between them was measured in yards, but it felt like the vast distance they'd been apart was finally, miraculously, about to close. 8 months, 243 days. That's how long Emma's world had revolved around a different kind of time zone. Not Eastern Standard, but Daddy time, calculated by the 7.5-hour difference between Kentucky and Kabul. Every morning started the same way. Emma would wake up and immediately check her phone, hoping for a message that had arrived while she slept. Sometimes there was a photos Michael in his gear giving a thumbs up with mountains in the background, or a video of him saying good night that was actually good morning in her world. Sometimes there was nothing, and those were the days that felt heavier. When Sarah would find Emma staring at her phone over breakfast, willing it to buzz with news from halfway around the world. The cheerleading practices had become Emma's anchor. 3 days a week, she'd throw herself into routines with a ferocity that surprised her coaches. The physical exhaustion helped quiet the constant hum of worry that had taken residence in her chest. Her teammates knew not to ask too many questions when Emma's eyes would suddenly fill with tears during water breaks, or when she'd grab her phone the moment practice ended, checking for messages with desperate urgency. Sarah had her own rituals. She'd learned to sleep with the ringer on, trained herself to recognize the distinct sound of her husband's video call notifications. She'd memorized the schedule of his patrols, knew which days he'd be out of communication, and had become an expert at reading between the lines of his carefully censored messages about his missions. The house had adapted to his absence in ways that broke Sarah's heart daily. Emma had stopped setting a place for him at dinner without being asked. His coffee mug had migrated to the back of the cabinet. The garage door opener in his truck had been moved to Sarah's key. These small accommodations to his absence felt like tiny betrayals, necessary but painful. But it was the big moments that hurt most. Emma's first day of 7th grade, when Sarah had to take the traditional first-day photos alone. The parent-teacher conferences, where Sarah sat in chairs, meant for two. The cheerleading tryouts where Emma had executed that perfect backflip and immediately looked to the empty bleachers, her smile faltering when she remembered he wasn't there to see it. Michael knew about these missed moments through carefully worded emails and whispered video calls. Sarah had learned to edit their life, sharing the victories while downplaying the tears. She'd sent him videos of Emma's cheerleading practices, but she wouldn't tell him about the nights Emma cried herself to sleep, or the way she'd started sleeping with one of his old t-shirts, the fabric now washed so many times it barely held his scent. The countdown to homecoming had been both a source of excitement and anxiety. Emma had made Sarah promise to record everything, every cheer, every routine, every moment, so Daddy could see it all when he got back. She'd practiced her routines in their backyard, using the deck as her stage, sometimes calling out, "Hi, Daddy," to the camera, as if he could somehow see her through the lens. 3 weeks before homecoming, during one of their evening video calls, Emma had shown Michael her uniform. She'd put it on specially for the call, complete with the bow in her hair and the white sneakers she'd begged Sarah to buy. "Do I look like a real cheerleader, Daddy?" she'd asked, and Michael had to mute himself for a moment to collect his composure. "You look perfect, baby girl," he'd managed to say. "I'm so proud of you." That night, after Emma had gone to bed, Sarah and Michael had stayed on the video call for 2 hours, just talking. She'd told him about Emma's nightmares, about the way she'd started asking fewer questions about when he was coming home, about how she seemed to be growing up faster in his absence. Michael had shared his own struggles, the guilt of missing her childhood, the fear that she might forget him, the way he carried her picture into every dangerous situation as both a reminder of what he was fighting for and what he had to lose. They'd made plans for his return, whenever that would be. Michael would take Emma to dinner, just the two of them. They'd go to her favorite place, the little diner where they used to share pancakes on Saturday mornings. They'd catch up on all the conversations that couldn't happen through a screen, all the hugs that had been stored up and waiting. But none of those plans had included this moment, this surprise that Sarah had orchestrated in secret, this gift of presence instead of absence, this homecoming that would happen at homecoming itself. As Michael walked across that field, he carried with him not just 8 months of separation, but 8 months of Emma's strength, her resilience, her ability to keep cheering even when her biggest cheerleader was 7,000 miles away. The crowd's silence seemed to acknowledge the weight of all those missed moments, all those nights of separate skies and different time zones, all the love that had been maintained across impossible distances. And in that silence, something beautiful was about to unfold, the moment when all that waiting would transform into a reunion, when all those stored-up hugs would finally find their home. Specialist Rodriguez had nudged Michael awake at 03 for 7 hours that morning in the transport plane somewhere over the Atlantic. "Chun, you're mumbling again," he'd whispered with a knowing smile. Michael had been dreaming about cheerleading routines he'd never seen, about a little girl in a uniform he'd only glimpsed through pixelated video calls. The decision to surprise Emma had been made in a moment of pure desperation 3 days earlier. Michael had been sitting in the communications tent, holding his satellite phone, about to call Sarah with the news that his return would be delayed another 2 weeks. He'd miss homecoming, miss Halabi, miss another piece of his daughter's childhood slipping away like sand through his fingers. That's when Sergeant Major Williams had appeared with orders that would change everything. "Chun, you're on the next transport out. 48-hour emergency leave. Family hardship approved." Michael had stared at the paperwork, confused. There was no family hardship. But Williams had winked and walked away, leaving Michael with a gift he hadn't dared to hope for. The flight home had been the longest 18 hours of his life, not because of the distance, but because of the anticipation. He'd spent months imagining this moment, but never like this. Never as a surprise, never with the element of shock and joy that would make it unforgettable. He'd written and rewritten what he'd say to Emma, practiced conversations that might never happen the way he'd rehearsed them. In his cargo pocket, wrapped in a piece of plastic from an MRE package, were 43 letters. He'd written one every week, sometimes more, addressed to my beautiful cheerleader. They chronicled everything he couldn't say in their monitored calls. His fears, his pride, his guilt over missing her growing up, his promise that he was fighting not just for his country, but for her future, for a world where she could cheer at football games without worrying about her daddy coming home. Michael had carried Emma's school photos on every patrol, tucked inside his helmet. It had been there when IEDs exploded too close for comfort, when mortar rounds shook the earth beneath his feet, when the loneliness of deployment threatened to swallow him whole. Her gap-toothed smile had been his talisman, his reminder that someone small and perfect was counting on him to be brave. The hardest part hadn't been the danger. It had been the guilt. Every video call where Emma looked a little older, a little more independent, had felt like an accusation. He'd missed her losing her first tooth, missed her learning to ride a bike without training wheels, missed the moment she'd mastered that backflip that had earned her a spot on the squad. These weren't just moments. They were building blocks of childhood that he'd never get back. His fellow soldiers understood this particular weight. They all carried it. The crushing responsibility of being simultaneously protector and absent father, hero and ghost in their children's lives. Late at night in their bunks, they'd share stories about their kids with a reverence usually reserved for prayer. Michael had shown Emma's cheerleading videos so many times that half his unit could recite her routines. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd spent 8 months protecting strangers' children while missing his own daughter's childhood. Every Afghan child who smiled and waved at their convoy reminded him of Emma. Every school they'd helped rebuild made him think of Jefferson High, where his daughter was learning to be strong in his absence. 3 hours before boarding the plane home, Michael had called his chaplain. "I'm scared, chaplain," he'd admitted. "What if she's forgotten me? What if I don't know how to be her daddy anymore?" The chaplain had smiled with understanding. "Son," he'd said, "love doesn't forget. It just waits. And waiting makes the reunion sweeter." Now, as Michael's boots touched the grass of Jefferson High's football field, he felt the weight of every step he'd taken in Emma's absence. Each stride across the field was a step back toward the father he'd been, toward the man who used to braid her hair before school and sing off-key lullabies at bedtime. The desert sand in his uniform was being replaced by Kentucky grass, the harsh sun of Afghanistan giving way to the soft glow of stadium lights. He could see her now, really see her, not through a grainy video screen, but in three-dimensional reality. She'd grown, her hair was longer, pulled back in the team's signature ponytail. Her uniform fit her differently than it had in their last video call. 8 months of his daughter's life had passed while he was protecting other people's children, and the magnitude of that sacrifice hit him like a physical blow. But she was there. She was real. She was his Emma, and he was finally, miraculously, home. The 43 letters in his pocket suddenly felt less heavy. The guilt he'd carried across 2 continents began to transform into gratitude. He hadn't missed everything. He was here for this moment, this perfect, impossible moment, when distance collapsed and love conquered geography and a father got to surprise his little girl in the most beautiful way imaginable. The clock on the Jefferson High scoreboard read 7:23 p.m. when Sarah's phone buzzed with a text that made her heart skip 3 beats. "I'm in the parking lot." Is she still facing away from the field? Sarah's hands trembled as she typed back. "Yes. 3rd routine starts in 5 minutes. She has no idea. From her seat in Section C, Rodosa Sarah had a perfect view of both her daughter and the field entrance where Michael would appear. For the past hour, she'd been a master of deception, cheering for the team while secretly coordinating the most important surprise of their family's life. Every time Emma had glanced up at the stands between routines, Sarah had waved normally, her smile hiding the secret that was about to change everything. Down on the track, Emma was lost in the rhythm of homecoming night, the energy of the crowd, the bright lights, the crisp October air. Everything felt electric. She'd executed her first 2 routines flawlessly, her backflips drawing cheers from the student section. For these precious moments, she wasn't the girl whose daddy was deployed. She was just Emma Chen, cheerleader, flying through the air with complete abandon. Her squad was preparing for their signature routine, the one they'd been perfecting all season. Emma took a position at the back of the formation, her white sneakers perfectly aligned with the yard markers painted on the grass. She had no idea that in the parking lot, just beyond the fence, her father was checking his reflection in his truck's side mirror, smoothing his uniform, and saying a prayer for courage. Michael's hands were shaking, not from combat nerves, those he knew how to manage. This was different. This was the fear of a father who hadn't held his daughter in 8 months, who had watched her grow up through a screen, who was about to step back into a life that had learned to continue without him. Principal Martinez had met Michael at the gate, shaking his hand with tears already forming in her eyes. "She talks about you every day," she'd whispered. "Every single day." The school's security guard, a Vietnam veteran himself, had quietly opened the field entrance and pointed toward the spot where Michael should wait for his cue. The stadium announcer's voice boomed across the field. "Ladies and gentlemen, please give your attention to our Jefferson High cheerleading squad as they perform their homecoming showcase routine." Emma's heartbeat synced with the opening drum beat of their music. She'd listened to this song hundreds of times, knew every beat, every moment where she'd leap or spin or flip. What she didn't know was that her mother had specifically requested this song, Coming Home by Diddy, because it seemed impossibly perfect for this moment. 3 rows behind Sarah, Mrs. Patterson pulled out her phone to record the routine, just like she did every game. She had no idea she was about to capture something that would make grown men cry and be shared across social media platforms for months to come. Sometimes the most beautiful moments in life happen when we're simply trying to document the ordinary. In the press box, Coach Williams was preparing his halftime speech when he noticed movement near the field entrance. He'd been told a special guest would be arriving, but seeing the soldier in desert camouflage, understanding immediately what was about to happen, made him reach for tissues he didn't know he'd need. The routine began. Emma and her squadmates moved in perfect sync, their voices carrying the cheer across the stadium. "We are Jefferson, mighty and strong. We've been waiting for this moment all season long." The irony of those words about waiting, about moments finally arriving, wasn't lost on Sarah, who was now openly crying in the stands. Michael took his first step onto the field as the routine hit its midpoint. Emma was in the center of a formation, preparing for her featured tumbling pass, the sequence that always made the crowd roar. She took 3 quick steps and launched into her signature series: round off, back handspring, full twisting layout. For those 4 seconds, she was airborne, completely unaware that her father was walking across the very ground she'd soon land on. The crowd was on its feet, cheering for Emma's perfect landing, when something shifted in the stadium's energy. It started with a few people noticing the soldier walking purposefully across the field. Then a ripple of recognition spread through the stands like a wave. Voices began to quiet. Phones came up to record, and a collective understanding passed through 50,000 people. They were about to witness something sacred. Emma, still facing the stands, noticed the change immediately. The crowd's energy had transformed from excitement to something deeper, more emotional. She could see people in the stands pointing toward the field behind her, some wiping their eyes, others holding their phones up to record something she couldn't see. "What's happening?" she asked Madison, her squadmate, during a brief pause in the routine. Madison, who was facing the field, went completely still. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "Emma," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the music. "Emma, turn around." But Emma was focused on the routine, on hitting every mark perfectly. She'd worked too hard to get distracted now. "I can't turn around," she whispered back. "We're in the middle of the routine." That's when the music stopped. Not because of a technical error, not because of a power failure, but because someone in the announcer's booth had made a decision that this moment was bigger than any routine, more important than any choreographed performance. In a sudden silence, you could hear autumn leaves rustling in the trees beyond the stadium, could hear the distant sound of traffic on the highway, could hear 50,000 people holding their breath. Emma stood frozen, her back still to the field, confusion written across her face. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was really only seconds. And in that silence, footsteps could be heard crossing the grass, steady, military precise, getting closer with each beat of a father's heart that had been separated from his daughter for far too long. Emma, her name, spoken in a voice she'd heard only through crackling phone connections for 8 months, cut through the stadium's silence, like a prayer, finally answered. Every cell in her body recognized that voice before her mind could process what was happening. She turned slowly, as if moving through honey, as if the world had shifted into a dream where impossible things became real. The white lines of the football field blurred at the edges of her vision. The bright stadium lights created halos around everything, and there in the center of it all, stood her father. For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, neither of them moved. Emma's eyes traveled from his combat boots to his desert camouflage uniform to his face. A face she'd memorized through pixelated video calls, now real and three-dimensional and impossibly present. He looked exactly the same, and completely different. Older somehow, with new lines around his eyes that spoke of distant places and difficult things. But his smile was exactly as she remembered. "Dad," the word escaped her lips as barely a whisper, a question and a prayer and a miracle all wrapped in 2 syllables. Michael nodded. His own voice caught somewhere between his heart and his throat. "Hi, baby girl." Time suspended itself. The stadium. The crowd. The October night. Everything else ceased to exist, except this space between a father and daughter. This sacred ground where 8 months of separation was about to collapse into nothing. Emma's pom-poms fell from her hands, hitting the grass with soft thuds that seemed louder than thunder in the profound silence. Her legs, so strong and sure during tumbling passes, suddenly felt like they might not support her. She took one tentative step forward, then another, as if testing whether this vision might disappear if she moved too quickly. Michael opened his arms. The same gesture that had comforted scraped knees and bad dreams, that had lifted her to his shoulders during parades, that had held her during thunderstorms and bedtime stories. Those arms that had been empty for so long that had ached with the phantom weight of holding air instead of his daughter. The dam broke. Emma launched herself toward him with all the stored energy of 8 months of missing him. Her feet barely touched the ground as she covered the distance between them, her cheerleading training giving her speed and grace even in this moment of pure emotion. She crashed into his chest with such force that he staggered backward, his arms wrapping around her so tightly it was as if he was trying to pull 8 months of separation out of existence through sheer willpower. The sound that came from Emma was something between a sob and a laugh and a scream of pure joy. It was the sound of a little girl who had been brave for so long finally allowing herself to fall apart. In the safest place in the world, her father's arms, her legs wrapped around his waist, her arms around his neck, her face buried against his shoulder where she could finally smell home again. Michael lifted her completely off the ground, spinning in a slow circle that had nothing to do with celebration and everything to do with the need to hold her, to prove to himself that she was real, that this wasn't another dream that would dissolve with his alarm clock. His own tears came without warning or permission. 8 months of careful military composure crumbling in the face of his daughter's absolute trust, her complete and immediate return to being his little girl. "I missed you," she sobbed against his neck, her words muffled by his uniform collar. "I missed you so much, Daddy. I thought you weren't coming home. I thought you forgot about my homecoming." "Never," he whispered fiercely into her hair, which smelled like strawberry shampoo and childhood and everything good he'd been fighting to protect. "I could never forget. I promised I'd be here, didn't I?" Around them, the stadium had erupted into something beyond applause. 50,000 people were on their feet. But this wasn't the manufactured enthusiasm of a sporting event. This was raw human emotion, shared and amplified by thousands of hearts that understood, in that moment, something fundamental about love and sacrifice and the price of freedom. Grown men openly wept. Mothers thought of their own children. Veterans saluted with tears streaming down their faces. Emma pulled back just enough to look at his face, her small hands framing his cheeks, as if she needed to memorize every detail, needed to prove to herself that he was really there. "Are you real? Are you really here?" Michael smiled through his tears, the same crooked smile that she'd inherited, the one that had been her first clear memory of him. "I'm real, baby girl. I'm here. I'm finally here." She kissed his forehead, his cheeks, his nose, quick, desperate kisses, as if she could somehow make up for 8 months of missing him through sheer quantity of affection. "Don't leave again," she whispered. And it wasn't a request, but a command from a 7-year-old who had learned young what it meant to love someone whose job required leaving. "Not tonight," he promised, and it was all he could promise. But it was enough for now. "Tonight, I'm all yours." The stadium lights caught the tears on both their faces, turning them into diamonds, into something precious and worthy of the moment they were illuminating. Michael adjusted his hold on Emma, supporting her weight effortlessly, muscle memory from 1,000 bedtime carries, kicking in as if no time had passed at all. In the stands, Sarah was sobbing openly, her phone forgotten in her lap, the moment too sacred to reduce to a recording. She was watching her family knit itself back together, watching the missing piece slide back into place with such perfect precision that it was hard to remember how they had ever functioned without it. Emma's squadmates stood in a respectful circle around them, their own eyes wet, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something holy. The game, the routines, the competition, all of it had become background to this moment of pure reunion. This display of love that transcended scoreboards and trophies and teenage concerns. Michael finally set Emma down, but kept his hands on her shoulders, needing to maintain physical contact, needing proof that she wouldn't disappear if he let go completely. She looked up at him with eyes that held 8 months of stored-up love and a maturity that broke his heart. His little girl had grown up in his absence, had learned to be strong when she needed to be soft. "Are you proud of me, Daddy?" she asked, and in that question was everything: her need for his approval, her fear that she'd somehow disappointed him by growing up while he was gone, her hope that she was still worthy of being his little girl. Michael knelt down to her level, his hands still on her shoulders, his eyes level with hers. "Emma Catherine Chen," he said, using her full name the way he did when he needed her to listen carefully. "I have never, ever been more proud of anyone in my entire life. You are the bravest, strongest, most beautiful girl in the world, and being your daddy is the greatest honor of my life." And there, on the 50-yard line of Jefferson High School, under lights that turned autumn air into magic, a father and daughter found each other again across impossible distances, proving that love really could conquer geography, that promises really could be kept, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe conspires to give us exactly the miracle we need, exactly when we need it most. The stadium slowly began to settle back into its Friday night rhythm, but something fundamental had shifted in the hearts of everyone who witnessed that moment, as Michael and Emma walked hand in hand toward the stands where Sarah waited. Their reunion had become part of the collective memory of Jefferson High, a story that would be told and retold, that would remind future generations about the real meaning of homecoming. Principal Martinez quietly announced over the PA system that the game would resume after a brief pause, but no one was thinking about football anymore. Conversations in the stands had turned to deeper things. Fathers calling their children, veterans sharing their own stories of separation and reunion, families holding each other a little tighter. Emma's surprise had rippled outward, touching strangers and reminding them of what truly mattered. Michael carried more than his daughter in his arms as they climbed the stadium steps. He carried the weight of every military family who understood this exact moment, the ones still waiting for their own reunions, the ones who would never have them, the ones who measured time in deployments and counted days until homecoming. Emma's joy was their joy. Her tears were their tears, and her father's return was a symbol of hope for every family learning to love across impossible distances. As they reached Sarah, the three of them embraced in a huddle that felt like coming home in the truest sense. Sarah's tears mixed with Michael's, their relief and gratitude, creating a private moment of grace within the public celebration. Emma remained in the center, the connecting point between her parents, the reason they had found strength to endure 8 months of separation. "Did you really think I'd miss this?" Michael whispered to his wife, his free arm pulling her closer. "I hoped," Sarah replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I hoped so hard I was afraid to believe it." Around them, the game continued, but the Chen family existed in their own bubble of reunion. They would stay for the rest of the evening, Michael cheering loudly for every routine, making up for 8 months of silent support with enthusiastic encouragement that made Emma beam with pride. Later, they would go to that little diner they'd talked about, where Emma would order pancakes at 11 p.m. and tell her father everything he'd missed, every detail that video calls couldn't capture. But the impact of this moment extended far beyond one family. In living rooms across the country, people would watch the video on their phones and remember their own stories of separation and reunion. Military spouses would show it to their children as proof that deployment has an end, that patience has a reward, that love really can survive anything. Veterans would see it and remember their own homecomings, their own children who had grown in their absence, their own moments of grace disguised as ordinary Friday nights. The beauty of Emma's surprise lay not just in its joy, but in its authenticity. This wasn't manufactured emotion or staged drama. This was real love, real sacrifice, real resilience, made visible under stadium lights. It was proof that in a world often filled with division and cynicism, the simple act of a father coming home to his daughter could still move thousands of people to tears, could still remind us of our shared humanity. Michael would return to his deployment in 2 days, but those 48 hours would sustain both him and Emma through the remaining months of separation. They would have new memories to hold on to, not just video calls and messages, but the feeling of his arms around her, the sound of his voice without digital interference, the proof that promises kept are worth waiting for. Emma would finish the season as a stronger cheerleader and a more confident young woman. She would carry the knowledge that her father had kept his word, that love could bridge any distance, that some surprises were worth the wait. Her teammates would remember the night their friend got her miracle, and they would cheer a little louder, hug their own families a little tighter, and understand that some moments are bigger than the games we play. The stadium would return to normal next Friday night, hosting another game under the same lights. But the grass where Michael and Emma reunited would forever hold the echo of that moment, a reminder that ordinary places can become sacred when love writes its story across them. And somewhere, on a deployment far from home, another service member would see this video and remember why they serve, why the sacrifice matters, why love is always worth fighting for. They would think of their own children growing up in their absence, their own promises yet to be kept, their own homecomings still to come. This is the power of one moment, one promise kept, one little girl lifted into her father's arms. It reminds us that love doesn't diminish across distance, that hope is always justified, and that sometimes the most profound miracles happen on ordinary Friday nights when we least expect them. If this story has touched your heart, if it has reminded you of the power of love and the price of freedom, share it with someone who needs to remember that separation has an end, that promises can be kept, and that love always, always finds a way home. Subscribe to hear more stories that remind us of the extraordinary moments hidden within ordinary lives, because every family has a story worth telling, and every homecoming is a miracle worth celebrating. The Chen family walked into the night together, whole again, carrying with them a moment that would last a lifetime, proof that some waits are worth it. Some surprises change everything, and some promises are sacred enough to move heaven and earth, to keep